Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into one of history's strangest chapters, the bizarre and baffling diseases that plagued medieval Europe. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy having your mind blown by historical oddities. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see our community of history enthusiasts from around the globe. Now, imagine living in a time when a simple headache might be diagnosed as an excess of yellow bile, when dancing uncontrollably in the streets was considered a genuine medical emergency, and when the cure for most ailments involved either prayers, peculiar potions made from crushed beetles, or if you were really unlucky, a good old-fashioned drilling into your skull. Welcome to medieval medicine, where science, superstition, and sheer creativity collided in the most spectacular ways. The medieval period, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was a time when Europe was trying to figure out, well, everything. The sophisticated medical knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome had largely been forgotten in Western Europe, though it flourished in the Islamic world. Christian doctrine shaped how people understood their bodies, with illness often seen as divine punishment or demonic possession. And into this knowledge vacuum rushed a fascinating mixture of folk wisdom, religious fervour, and genuine attempts at understanding the human condition. What makes medieval diseases so captivating isn't just their strangeness. It's how they reveal the medieval mindset. Every bizarre diagnosis, every outlandish cure, tells us something about how our ancestors tried to make sense of a world without microscopes, without germ theory, without even basic anatomy textbooks. They were doing their best with what they had, which was mainly observation, tradition, and a hefty dose of imagination. Some of the conditions we'll explore tonight were real diseases interpreted through a medieval lens. Others might have been psychological phenomena shaped by the intense social and religious pressures of the time, and some remain complete mysteries that baffle historians and medical professionals to this day. What they all share is a window into a world where the line between medicine and magic was blurrier than a manuscript illuminated by candlelight. We'll meet people who couldn't stop dancing, folks who believed they were made of glass, and entire communities struck by mysterious sweating sickness that could kill within hours. We'll explore why medieval Europeans thought werewolves were a medical condition, why they believed too much studying could literally melt your brain, and why they were convinced that wandering wombs caused everything from anxiety to fainting spells. But here's what's really fascinating. While some of these medieval ideas seem laughably wrong to us now, others contain kernels of truth that modern medicine has validated. Medieval physicians noticed connections between environment and health, recognized the importance of quarantine during epidemics, and understood that mental and physical health were interconnected, even if they explained it through the lens of humours and vapours. So dim the lights, maybe light a candle for that authentic medieval ambience, though hopefully with better ventilation than a medieval cottage, and prepare yourself for a journey into the weird, wonderful, and occasionally terrifying world of medieval diseases. Trust me, after learning about what passed for medical care in the Middle Ages, you'll never complain about waiting at the doctor's office again. Let's start with perhaps the most bizarrely captivating epidemic in medieval history, the dancing plague, also known as dancing mania or St. Vitus's dance. Picture this. It's a hot July day in 1518 in Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire. A woman named Frau Trophaea steps into the street and begins to dance. Not a happy jig or a celebratory twirl, but an intense compulsive dancing that she seemingly cannot control. She dances through the day, through the night, her feet bloodied, her face twisted in exhaustion and distress. She wants to stop, desperately wants to stop, but her body won't let her. Within a week, 34 others had joined her. Within a month, the number had swelled to around 400 people, all dancing uncontrollably in the streets of Strasbourg. They danced until they collapsed from exhaustion, and when they recovered, they got up and danced again. Some danced themselves to death, their hearts giving out from the continuous exertion, their feet worn down to bloody stumps. Contemporary chronicles report that at the peak of the outbreak, 15 people were dying per day from dancing. Now you might think the authorities would try to stop this, maybe restrain people or sedate them somehow. But no, the learned physicians and civic authorities of Strasbourg had a different idea. They decided that the afflicted needed to dance the disease out of their systems. They actually set up stages in public squares, hired musicians, and encouraged the dancers to keep going. They even brought in professional dancers to join them, thinking that more dancing would cure the dancing. It was like trying to cure drowning by adding more water. The dancing plague of 1518 wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the medieval period, from the 7th century onward, there are records of dancing manias striking communities across Europe. In 1374, thousands of people danced through the streets in what's now Belgium, Netherlands, and northeastern France. They screamed, laughed, begged for mercy from saints, and claimed to see visions. Some jumped into rivers, others ran headfirst into walls. The dancers would travel from town to town, and like a contagious condition, new people would join the compulsive dancing wherever they went. Medieval physicians and clergy had various explanations for these outbreaks. Some blamed it on hot blood, literally believing that the blood had become overheated and needed to be cooled through exhaustion. Others pointed to astrological alignments, particularly the influence of St. Vitus, whose feast day seemed to coincide with some outbreaks. The Catholic Church often diagnosed it as demonic possession, organising mass exorcisms and pilgrimages to holy sites. But here's where it gets even stranger. The dancing wasn't always random or chaotic. Witnesses described coordinated movements, similar gestures, and shared visions among the dancers. They would often claim to see the heavens opening up, or rivers of blood, or the Virgin Mary herself. Many dancers said they felt like their feet were in fire, or that they were being forced to dance by invisible musicians. Some begged bystanders to tie them up to stop the dancing, while others became violent if anyone tried to restrain them. Modern theories about the dancing plague are almost as varied as medieval ones, though hopefully more scientific. Some historians suggest ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on damp rye and produces compounds similar to LSD. A bad batch of bread could theoretically cause hallucinations and convulsions. But this doesn't fully explain the social contagion aspect, or why the dancing took such specific forms. Other scholars point to mass psychogenic illness, essentially a form of mass hysteria brought on by the extreme stress of medieval life. The 14th and 15th centuries were particularly rough, with famines, plagues, and religious upheavals creating a population primed for psychological breaking points. In this theory, one person's psychological crisis could trigger a community-wide response, especially in small, tightly knit communities where social bonds were strong and individual identity was less defined than communal identity. There's also the theory of religious ecstasy gone wrong. Medieval Christianity, particularly in certain regions and periods, emphasized intense physical expressions of faith, flagellation, fasting to the point of hallucination, elaborate physical penances. The dancing might have started as a form of religious expression that spiraled out of control, becoming a compulsion that merged religious fervour with physical exhaustion. What's particularly fascinating is how the dancing plague reflects medieval understanding of the body and mind. They didn't have our modern distinction between psychological and physical illness. Everything was understood as part of the same system. A disturbed mind could literally heat the blood, which would rise to the brain and cause madness. Spiritual corruption could manifest as physical symptoms. The boundary between the individual and the community was also more porous. One person's affliction could spread through sympathy or shared humours. The dancing plagues gradually disappeared as Europe moved into the modern era. The last major outbreak was in the 1840s, and since then, nothing on the same scale has been recorded. Perhaps changes in diet, religious practice, social structure, or simply different ways of expressing psychological distress ended this particular phenomenon. Or maybe, as some historians suggest, we still have our dancing plagues. We just call them different things and express them in different ways. Moving from collective mania to individual delusion, let's explore one of the most peculiar psychological conditions of the medieval and early modern period, the glass delusion. Imagine being absolutely convinced that your entire body or parts of it had transformed into glass. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally made of glass. You move with extreme caution, terrified that a sudden gesture might cause you to shatter into 1,000 pieces. You refuse to sit down, fearing your glass buttocks will break. You wear special padded clothing to protect your fragile glass limbs. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was a recognised medical condition that afflicted numerous people, including royalty throughout medieval and Renaissance Europe. The most famous sufferer was King Charles VI of France, who ruled from 1380 to 1422. Charles, already known for his bouts of madness, he was called Charles the Mad, became convinced that he was made entirely of glass. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent his glass body from shattering if someone bumped into him. He refused to let people touch him, and would sometimes stand perfectly still for hours, afraid that any movement might cause him to break apart. But Charles wasn't alone in his crystalline concerns. The glass delusion appeared throughout Europe, particularly among the educated and wealthy classes. Princess Alexandra Amalie of Bavaria was convinced her childhood swallowing of a glass piano had left the instrument inside her, intact and full-sized. She would walk sideways through doorways, terrified of shattering the piano within. A scholar in Leyden believed his glass buttocks would break if he sat, so he remained standing for years, even sleeping propped up against walls. What makes the glass delusion particularly fascinating is how specific and consistent it was across different cases. Sufferers didn't just think they were fragile, they specifically believed they were made of glass. They could often pinpoint exactly when and how the transformation occurred. One man claimed he had turned to glass after falling into a furnace. Another believed a witch's curse had transformed him during a full moon. An Italian nobleman was convinced that only his internal organs were glass, and he could hear them clinking together when he walked. The medieval medical establishment took the glass delusion seriously. It was documented in medical texts, discussed at universities, and various treatments were attempted. Some physicians tried to cure patients through elaborate ruses. One doctor hired actors to pretend to accidentally drop and shatter glass objects near the patient, then revealed that the objects were actually made of wood or metal, hoping to prove that glass wasn't as fragile as feared. Another physician had a patient's room filled with straw and then pushed the patient down, showing them they hadn't shattered, therefore proving they weren't made of glass. Other treatments were more brutal. Some doctors believed the delusion came from an excess of melancholic humour, so they prescribed purges, bloodletting, and special diets to rebalance the humours. Patients were sometimes forced to sit or lie down against their will, to prove they wouldn't break. One particularly creative physician pretended to set a patient's bed on fire, forcing them to jump out and run, thereby demonstrating their non-glass nature through their survival of vigorous movement. But here's what's really intriguing. The glass delusion tells us something profound about the medieval mind and its relationship with material culture. Glass was still relatively rare and precious in medieval Europe. It was associated with wealth, sophistication, and almost magical properties. Venetian glassmakers were essentially imprisoned on the island of Murano to protect trade secrets. Glass windows were so valuable they were removed and taken along when nobles moved between residences. The transparency of glass also held symbolic meaning in medieval culture. It represented purity, divine light, the immaterial soul trapped in material form. Medieval theologians used glass as a metaphor for the Virgin Mary. Light passed through her as through glass without breaking or staining it. To believe oneself made of glass might have been a complex expression of spiritual anxiety, social fragility, or a desire for transcendence gone wrong. Interestingly, the glass delusion began to disappear as glass became more common and less mysterious. By the 18th century, as glass manufacturing improved, and glass objects became everyday items rather than precious rarities, the delusion virtually vanished. People stopped believing they could turn into glass around the same time glass stopped being special. Today, the glass delusion is essentially extinct, though psychiatrists occasionally report patients who believe their bones are made of glass or similarly fragile materials. Modern psychology might diagnose the glass delusion as a specific form of delusional disorder or a culturally bound syndrome, a mental illness that only makes sense within a particular cultural context. Just as we don't see cases of people believing they're possessed by telegraph wires anymore, the glass delusion was intimately connected to medieval and Renaissance understanding of materials, bodies, and the relationship between physical and spiritual existence. Some historians argue that the glass delusion was particularly common among scholars and nobility, because these were people under intense social pressure in rigidly hierarchical societies. The delusion expressed their sense of fragility and vulnerability in a world where a single misstep, political, social, or religious, could indeed shatter their lives. It's no coincidence that King Charles VI, developed his glass delusion during a period of intense political instability and personal trauma. Now let's explore a disease that was all too real and absolutely terrifying: the English sweating sickness, or pseudo-anglicus, as contemporary physicians called it. This mysterious disease appeared suddenly in England in 1485, struck 5 more times over the next 70 years, and then vanished completely, leaving medical historians scratching their heads to this day. Unlike the gradual onset of most medieval diseases, the sweat could kill you in a matter of hours, and it seemed to have a particular taste for the wealthy and healthy, sparing the poor and sickly in a reversal of typical medieval disease patterns. The first outbreak came with Henry Tudor's army in 1485, right after the Battle of Bosworth Field that ended the Wars of the Roses. Within weeks of Henry's coronation as Henry VII, London was in the grip of a terrifying new disease. It struck with shocking suddenness. Victims would feel fine at breakfast and be dead by dinner. The progression was horrifyingly consistent: sudden onset of apprehension and chills, violent headache, severe pains in the neck, shoulders and limbs, followed by intense sweating that gave the disease its name. The sweat poured off victims in torrents, soaking through bedclothes and mattresses. But here's the truly bizarre part. While you were sweating, you had to stay awake. Contemporary accounts insist that falling asleep meant certain death. Families would take turns keeping victims conscious, walking them around, talking to them, even slapping them to prevent sleep. One chronicle describes households where multiple family members were sick, desperately trying to keep each other awake while fighting their own exhaustion and illness. Whether staying awake actually helped or was just medieval medical superstition, we'll never know, but the terror of falling asleep while sweating became embedded in English cultural memory. The disease had a peculiar social preference that baffled medieval physicians. It seemed to target the wealthy, the young and the healthy, particularly men between 15 and 45. The poor, the elderly, children and women were relatively spared. Monasteries full of well-fed monks were devastated, while nearby villages of peasants went untouched. The royal court was particularly vulnerable. The disease seemed to follow nobility like a shadow. Cardinal Wolsey caught it 3 times and survived each time, though he described the experience as worse than death itself. The symptoms were unlike anything else known to medieval medicine. Plague killed with buboes and blackened flesh. Tuberculosis consumed slowly. But the sweat struck like lightning. John Caius, a physician who witnessed the 1551 outbreak, described the early symptoms in detail. A sudden sense of apprehension, as if something terrible was about to happen, followed by cold shivers, dizziness, headache, and severe pain in the shoulders and limbs. Then came the characteristic sweating. Not normal perspiration, but a drenching, foul-smelling sweat that seemed to pour from every pore. The sweating phase was critical. Too much heat and the patient died. Too much cold and the patient died. Contemporary treatment advice reads like a tightrope walking manual. Keep the patient warm but not hot, covered but not smothered, hydrated but not overhydrated. Windows must be closed but air must circulate. The patient must be kept perfectly still but not allowed to sleep. One wrong move in any direction could apparently prove fatal. What made the sweat even more terrifying was its pattern of recurrence. After the initial 1485 outbreak, it returned in 1508, 1517, 1528 and 1551, each time seeming to follow trade routes and affecting England far more severely than anywhere else. The 1528 outbreak was particularly severe, killing thousands in London alone. It spread to continental Europe that year, causing panic in Hamburg, Amsterdam and other trading cities, but it never established itself permanently outside of England. The social response to the sweat reveals much about medieval and Tudor society. When the disease struck, those who could afford it fled the cities for the countryside, though the disease often seemed to follow them. Henry VIII was terrified of the sweat. He would flee London at the first rumour of an outbreak, moving from palace to palace, dismissing servants at the slightest sign of illness. When Anne Boleyn caught the sweat in 1528 and survived, Henry sent her away from court until he was sure she was no longer contagious. Religious explanations dominated public discourse. Many saw the sweat as divine punishment for England's sins, particularly the break with Rome during Henry VIII's reign. Others blamed it on astrological conjunctions, poisonous mists rising from the earth, or even French spies poisoning wells. The fact that it primarily affected the English led to theories about English diet, English climate, or even the English constitution being somehow unique. Medical treatments range from the reasonable to the bizarre. Moderate approaches included rest, light diet, and herbal remedies like mint, marigold, and endive. More extreme treatments involved complex potions made from unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, crushed pearls, and gold leaf. Some physicians recommended preventive measures like carrying sweet-smelling herbs, avoiding exercise, and maintaining emotional equilibrium. Cardinal Wolsey's personal physician prescribed a regimen of regular purging and bloodletting to prevent the disease, though given that Wolsey caught it 3 times, the effectiveness seems questionable. Modern medical historians have proposed various theories about what the sweat actually was. Some suggest it was a form of hantavirus, spread by rodents, and explaining why it affected the wealthy, who had more grain stores attracting rats, more than the poor. Others propose it was an arbovirus, like a severe form of influenza, which would explain its seasonal patterns and sudden disappearance. The fact that it vanished completely after 1551 might suggest the population developed immunity, the pathogen mutated into something less virulent, or environmental conditions changed. There's even a theory that the sweat was an early form of what we now call Picardy sweat, a disease that appeared in France in the 18th and 19th centuries with remarkably similar symptoms. But without preserved tissue samples or detailed genetic analysis, we'll likely never know for certain what caused the English sweating sickness. Let's delve into one of the most mysterious and terrifying afflictions of the medieval world, St. Anthony's fire, also known as holy fire or ignis sacer. This wasn't one disease, but rather a complex of symptoms that could strike entire communities without warning, causing hallucinations, convulsions, and a burning sensation so intense that sufferers felt their limbs were literally on fire. The really disturbing part: sometimes their limbs would turn black and fall off, bloodlessly, as if they'd been carefully amputated by an invisible surgeon. The first well-documented outbreak occurred in France in 945 CE, when thousands of people in the region of Aquitaine began experiencing mysterious symptoms. It started with a creeping cold in the limbs, like ice spreading through the veins. Then came the burning, an internal fire that no amount of water could quench. Victims screamed that demons were roasting them from the inside. Their fingers and toes would turn black, dry up, and eventually just fall off. Some lost entire limbs this way, the blackened appendages separating cleanly from the body, with barely any bleeding. Medieval physicians and clergy were baffled. The symptoms didn't match any known disease. Some victims recovered completely, others were left permanently disfigured, and many died in agony. The randomness was terrifying. Entire families might be struck down while their neighbours remained healthy, or one person in a household would be affected while others eating the same food were fine. The religious response was immediate and intense. The disease became associated with Saint Anthony, the Egyptian hermit who was said to have battled demons in the desert. The Order of Saint Anthony, established in 1095, specialised in treating victims of holy fire. Their hospitals, called Antonine monasteries, spread across Europe, becoming centres of medieval medical knowledge. The monks developed treatments that, while they didn't understand why, actually helped. They fed patients white bread made from wheat instead of rye, removed them from their normal environment, and amputated gangrenous limbs before infection spread. But along with the physical symptoms came something equally disturbing: the mental effects. Victims of St. Anthony's fire reported terrifying visions that seemed absolutely real. They saw demons dancing in the flames, angels weeping blood, and their dead relatives calling to them from beyond the grave. Some became convinced they could fly and threw themselves from windows. Others believed they had transformed into animals and would crawl on all fours, barking or meowing. Entire communities might experience shared hallucinations, seeing the same visions at the same time. The chronicler Sigibert of Gembloux, writing in the 12th century, described one outbreak where victims saw the heavens open and fire rain down upon the earth. Another account tells of a village where everyone became convinced they were wolves for 3 days, hunting in packs through the streets until the delusion passed. These weren't considered separate from the physical disease, but part of the same divine or demonic affliction. Medieval artists depicted St. Anthony's fire in horrifying detail. Hieronymus Bosch's paintings of St. Anthony's Temptations, with their bizarre hybrid creatures and nightmarish landscapes, might have been inspired by the hallucinations reported by sufferers. The Isenheim altarpiece, painted by Matthias Grunewald for an Antonine monastery, shows victims of the disease with disturbing medical accuracy. The blackened limbs, the contorted positions of agony, the expressions of simultaneous ecstasy and horror. What made St. Anthony's fire particularly puzzling was its seasonal and geographic patterns. It struck most often after wet summers and in regions where rye was the primary grain. Some areas would be devastated year after year, while others never experienced an outbreak. Wealthy monasteries and noble houses were often spared, while peasant communities were ravaged. This led to various theories: divine punishment for sin, poisoned wells by enemies, or corrupted air from swamps and graveyards. The symptoms were so varied that medieval physicians identified several types of holy fire. There was the convulsive type, where victims suffered violent seizures and muscle spasms. The gangrenous type caused the characteristic blackening and loss of limbs, and the hallucinogenic type brought on the visions and madness. Some unfortunate souls experienced all three, creating a perfect storm of medieval medical horror. It wasn't until the 17th century that people began to suspect a connection between St. Anthony's fire and contaminated grain, and not until the 19th century that scientists identified the true culprit: ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains in damp conditions. Ergot contains powerful alkaloids, including compounds similar to LSD. When consumed in contaminated bread, these chemicals cause vasoconstriction, explaining the gangrene, hallucinations and convulsions. The realization that St. Anthony's fire was actually ergotism, poisoning from contaminated grain, revolutionized understanding of medieval history. Suddenly, many mysterious events had potential explanations. Some historians suggest the Salem witch trials might have been triggered by ergot poisoning. The Great Fear during the French Revolution, when peasants across France simultaneously panicked about aristocratic plots, might have been influenced by contaminated grain supplies. But knowing the cause doesn't diminish the horror of what medieval people experienced. Imagine eating your daily bread, the most basic, sacred food in Christian culture, and having it transform you into a hallucinating, gangrenous victim of what seemed like divine punishment. The very staff of life became an instrument of torment, now for something completely different, a disease that could supposedly only be cured by the touch of a king. Scrofula, known romantically as the king's evil, was a tuberculous infection of the lymph nodes in the neck that created large, unsightly swellings. But what made this disease unique in medieval medicine wasn't its symptoms. It was the belief that monarchs had the divine power to cure it with their royal touch. The practice of royal touching for scrofula began in medieval France and England, rooted in the belief that kings ruled by divine right, and therefore possessed healing powers directly from God. Edward the Confessor in England and Philip I in France were among the first monarchs recorded as touching for the king's evil in the 11th century. By the High Middle Ages, it had become an elaborate ritual that demonstrated both royal power and divine approval. The ceremony was remarkably consistent across centuries. Sufferers would gather at appointed times, often great religious festivals like Easter or Christmas. They had to be certified as having true scrofula by royal physicians. No other diseases qualified for the royal touch. The king would then touch each sufferer, usually stroking the swellings on their neck while prayers were said. In England, the monarch would hang a gold coin called an angel around the sufferer's neck. In France, the king would make the sign of the cross over the swellings and say, "The king touches you, God heals you." The numbers involved were staggering. Edward I of England touched roughly 1,000 people per year. During his reign, Louis XIV of France touched more than 200,000 people. Charles II of England, after the Restoration, touched nearly 100,000 sufferers between 1660 and 1682. Special coins were minted just for these ceremonies, and court records meticulously documented each touching ceremony. What's fascinating is that people genuinely believed it worked. Contemporary accounts are full of testimonials from people who claimed complete cure after the royal touch. Educated physicians wrote treatises explaining the medical theory behind the king's healing power. The royal touch was considered so effective that certificates of touching became valuable documents, and people would travel hundreds of miles for the opportunity. The medical establishment had elaborate explanations for why the royal touch worked. Some physicians argued that the king's sacred blood contained special healing properties that could be transmitted through touch. Others believed that the ceremony's religious power, combined with the king's divine authority, could drive out the evil humours causing the disease. There were even theories about royal perspiration containing curative properties. The heat and moisture from the king's hand supposedly rebalanced the cold, dry humours that caused scrofula. But scrofula was a particularly clever disease for monarchs to claim to cure. Unlike plague or sweating sickness, which killed quickly, scrofula was usually chronic but not immediately fatal. The swellings would often appear and disappear naturally over time. Many cases would eventually resolve on their own, especially in younger sufferers with stronger immune systems. This meant that a significant percentage of people touched by the king would eventually recover, seeming to prove the treatment's effectiveness. The political implications of the royal touch were enormous. It was living proof of the divine right of kings, a visible demonstration that the monarch was God's chosen representative on earth. Pretenders to the throne would attempt to prove their legitimacy by touching for scrofula. When competing claimants both claimed to cure the king's evil, it created a kind of medieval medical legitimacy crisis. The practice created an entire economy around royal healing. Sufferers needed transportation to royal touching ceremonies, accommodation while waiting, and documentation of their disease. Professional guides emerged who specialised in bringing scrofula patients to court. Inns near royal palaces advertised their proximity to touching venues. Forgers created fake touching certificates for those who couldn't afford or manage the journey. Different monarchs had different styles of touching. Henry VII was known for his gentle, almost tender touch. Henry VIII, before his break with Rome, was particularly enthusiastic, sometimes touching hundreds in a single day. Elizabeth found the practice distasteful, but recognised its political importance, wearing gloves and having attendants wash her hands with rosewater between touches. James I of England was sceptical of the practice and reluctant to perform it, leading to accusations that he lacked true royal authority. The Protestant Reformation complicated the royal touch. Protestant theologians argued that such miraculous healing was superstitious popery, not appropriate for Reformed Christianity. Yet Protestant monarchs continued the practice because of its political value. This created theological gymnastics as royal chaplains tried to explain how the Protestant royal touch was scientific and rational, while the Catholic version was superstitious nonsense. Some monarchs tried to modernise the practice. Charles II combined touching with distribution of specially minted gold angels, which sufferers were told to wear continuously. The coins themselves became viewed as talismans with healing properties, creating a secondary market in royal healing tokens. Some people collected multiple touches from different occasions, wearing strings of gold angels as both medicine and investment. The royal touch for scrofula persisted surprisingly long. Queen Anne was the last British monarch to perform the ceremony, touching the young Samuel Johnson in 1712. He wasn't cured and bore scrofula scars his entire life. In France, the practice continued until Charles X touched sufferers at his coronation in 1825, well into the age of modern medicine. Perhaps no medieval medical condition better illustrates the blurred line between medicine, theology, and folklore than clinical lycanthropy, the genuine belief that one had transformed into a wolf. While we might dismiss werewolves as pure superstition today, medieval physicians treated lycanthropy as a real medical condition, with specific symptoms, causes, and treatments. Medical texts from the period describe it alongside other recognised diseases, complete with diagnostic criteria and therapeutic recommendations. The medical condition of lycanthropy was distinct from the folkloric werewolf, though the two often overlapped in medieval minds. Clinical lycanthropy involved people who genuinely believed they had transformed into wolves or, in some variations, other animals. They would run on all fours, howl at the moon, attack livestock, eat raw meat, and flee human company to live in forests and graveyards. Unlike demonic possession, which was a spiritual affliction, lycanthropy was understood as a medical condition, affecting the balance of humours in the brain. Medieval medical texts describe the symptoms with remarkable clinical detail. The Persian physician Avicenna, whose medical texts were widely used in medieval Europe, wrote that lycanthropes developed hollow eyes, dry tongues, excessive thirst, and wounds on their limbs from running through thorns and rocks. They had excellent night vision, but became confused in daylight. Most tellingly, they were drawn to graveyards and would dig up recently buried corpses, a symptom that terrified medieval communities and often led to the sufferer's execution. Paul of Aegina, a Byzantine physician whose works influenced medieval medicine, identified lycanthropy as a form of melancholic disorder. He noted that sufferers maintained human intelligence even while believing themselves transformed, creating a horrifying dual consciousness where the person was aware of their human thoughts but unable to control their wolf-like behaviours. They would later remember their actions with shame and horror, adding to their mental anguish. The causes of lycanthropy, according to medieval medicine, were varied. An excess of black bile, the melancholic humour, could corrupt the imagination and make people believe they had transformed. Certain foods were thought to trigger the condition: eating the brains of bears, drinking water from wolf footprints, or consuming certain herbs. The full moon's influence on bodily humours was also blamed, establishing the enduring connection between werewolves and lunar cycles. But medieval physicians also recognised what we might now call environmental and psychological triggers. Isolation, particularly for shepherds and hunters who spent long periods alone in wilderness, was a known risk factor. Traumatic experiences, especially involving wolves, could trigger the delusion. Some texts mention that wearing wolfskins for warmth could gradually convince the wearer they were becoming a wolf, an interesting early observation of how external changes might influence internal identity. Treatments for lycanthropy ranged from gentle to brutal. Moderate physicians recommended bringing the patient back to civilization, providing companionship, music, and pleasant diversions to restore their human nature. Warm baths with sweet herbs were prescribed to rebalance the humours. Special diets avoiding red meat and emphasising cooling foods like lettuce and cucumber were recommended. More aggressive treatments reflected the desperation of dealing with someone who might attack others in their delusion. Patients were sometimes beaten to remind them of their humanity, bled to remove excess melancholic humour, or subjected to extended periods of prayer and fasting. One Byzantine treatment involved surprising the lycanthrope by suddenly revealing their reflection in a mirror or still water, shocking them back to human consciousness by showing them their true form. The social response to clinical lycanthropy varied dramatically. Some communities treated sufferers with compassion, recognising it as illness rather than evil. The wealthy might keep lycanthropic family members confined but cared for in private estates. Monasteries sometimes took in lycanthropes, believing that religious discipline and prayer could cure the condition. But more often the response was fear and violence. Lycanthropes were frequently executed, either as dangerous madmen or as willing servants of the devil. The fact that some sufferers actually attacked people or animals in their delusion made them genuinely dangerous. Court records from medieval France describe several cases of people executed for werewolfism, after killing children while believing themselves transformed. The case of Peter Stump, executed in Germany in 1589, shows how clinically lycanthropy intersected with witch trials and religious persecution. Stump confessed under torture to being a werewolf who had made a pact with the devil, receiving a magical belt that transformed him into a wolf. Whether he suffered from clinically lycanthropy, was a serial killer using werewolf stories as cover, or was simply a victim of religious hysteria remains debated. What's particularly interesting is how the symptoms of clinical lycanthropy might have had real medical causes that medieval medicine couldn't understand. Some modern researchers suggest that some cases might have been rabies, which causes aggression, confusion, and animal-like behaviour. Others might have been suffering from porphyria, a genetic condition that causes sensitivity to light, excessive hair growth, and neurological symptoms. Hypertrichosis, which causes excessive hair growth all over the body, combined with mental illness, might have convinced both sufferers and observers of actual transformation. The geographical distribution of lycanthropy cases is revealing. Reports were most common in regions with actual wolf populations: France, Germany, Eastern Europe. In areas without wolves, like England after their extinction, people believed they transformed into other animals. This suggests that environmental factors and cultural expectations shaped the specific form the delusion took. Medieval medicine had many peculiar theories, but few were as persistent or as influential as the concept of the wandering womb, the belief that the uterus could detach from its proper position and wander around the female body like an internal tourist, causing various ailments wherever it decided to visit. This wasn't a fringe theory, but mainstream medical doctrine, taught in universities and treated in medical texts with complete seriousness. The theory originated with ancient Greek physicians but reached new heights of elaborate explanation in medieval Europe. According to medical authorities, the womb was almost like a separate creature living inside women, with its own desires, appetites, and ability to move. When unhappy or unfulfilled, it would leave its proper place and travel through the body, pressing on other organs and causing symptoms wherever it lodged. If the womb wandered up to the throat, it caused choking, loss of voice, and what we might now recognise as anxiety attacks. Women would feel like they were being strangled from the inside, unable to speak or breathe properly. Medieval physicians called this suffocation of the mother being another term for the womb, and it was one of the most commonly diagnosed female ailments. When the womb travelled to the head, it caused headaches, dizziness, and mental disturbances. Women might experience what medieval doctors called brain fever, confusion, hallucinations, and emotional instability. If it pressed against the heart, it caused palpitations and fainting. If it moved to the liver, it caused digestive problems and melancholy. There was virtually no symptom that couldn't be blamed on the wandering womb. Medieval medical texts provided detailed maps of the womb's possible travels through the body. Some physicians believed it could move through blood vessels, others that it travelled through mysterious channels unique to the female body. Anatomical drawings from the period show the uterus with little feet or wings, emphasising its mobile nature. One particularly creative illustration shows the womb as a small demon that needed to be controlled or appeased. The causes of womb wandering were, according to medieval physicians, related to female sexuality and reproduction. An unused womb, belonging to virgins, widows, or women whose husbands were away, became restless and started travelling. A dry womb, lacking male seed, would move seeking moisture. A cold womb would seek warmth. A hot womb would seek cooling. The womb was portrayed as having an almost conscious desire for fulfillment that, when frustrated, led to pathological wandering. Treatments for the wandering womb range from the practical to the bizarre. The most commonly prescribed cure was marriage and regular marital relations, based on the belief that pregnancy would anchor the womb in place. For unmarried women or widows, this created a terrible catch-22. Their medical condition required a treatment that was morally and socially forbidden. Other treatments tried to lure the womb back to its proper position through various means. Sweet-smelling substances like roses, musk, or amber were placed near the female organs to attract the womb downward. Conversely, foul-smelling substances like burnt feathers, sulphur, or garlic were held near the nose to repel the womb away from the upper body. The logic was that the womb, like an animal, was attracted to pleasant smells and repelled by unpleasant ones. Physical treatments included massage to manually push the womb back into place, special positions and exercises designed to encourage proper womb positioning, and the use of pessaries, devices inserted to hold the womb in position. Some physicians recommended wearing tight girdles or belts to physically prevent the womb from wandering. Others prescribed special chairs with holes in the seat through which fumigations could be administered to the womb. The psychological impact of the wandering womb diagnosis was profound. Any physical or emotional problem a woman experienced could be attributed to her wandering womb, effectively dismissing other potential causes. Women's testimonies about their symptoms were often ignored in favour of the predetermined diagnosis. It became a catch-all explanation that prevented proper investigation of women's health issues. The wandering womb theory also had legal implications. Women's testimony in court could be dismissed because their wandering wombs made them unreliable. Women were excluded from certain professions because their wandering wombs made them emotionally unstable. The theory was used to justify everything from denying women education, studying would draw blood to the brain, encouraging the womb to follow, to restricting their physical activities. Some medieval women and female medical practitioners pushed back against the wandering womb theory. Trotula of Salerno, one of the few known female physicians of the medieval period, wrote that many women's diseases had the same causes as men's diseases and should be treated similarly. Hildegard of Bingen, while accepting some aspects of humoral theory, provided more nuanced explanations for women's health issues that didn't rely solely on womb wandering. The theory persisted well beyond the medieval period. It wasn't until anatomical dissections became more common in the Renaissance that physicians realised the womb was firmly attached by ligaments and couldn't possibly wander. Even then, the idea that the uterus was the source of female emotional and physical problems persisted, eventually morphing into the concept of hysteria, from the Greek word for uterus, that dominated women's healthcare into the 20th century. Among the many afflictions that struck medieval Europe, few were as visually horrifying or as theologically loaded as what physicians called Job's disease, a condition that covered sufferers with painful, seeping boils from head to toe. Named after the biblical figure who was struck with boils as a test of faith, this disease carried both medical and spiritual significance that shaped how medieval society understood and responded to it. The disease that medieval physicians called Job's disease was likely several different conditions that presented with similar symptoms: extensive skin lesions, boils and ulcers. Some cases were probably severe bacterial infections, others might have been forms of pemphigus or other autoimmune conditions, and still others could have been extreme allergic reactions or manifestations of systemic diseases. But to medieval medicine, they were all variations of the same divine affliction that had struck the biblical Job. The symptoms were genuinely horrific. Sufferers developed painful boils that could cover their entire body. These weren't simple pimples, but deep, infected abscesses that could be as large as eggs. They would fill with pus and blood, eventually bursting and leaving open wounds that were slow to heal. The pain was described as constant and unbearable, like being burned with hot irons or having needles pushed into every inch of skin. Medieval medical texts described the progression in disturbing detail. It usually started with a few boils on the torso or limbs. Within days or weeks they would spread across the entire body. The scalp would become covered, making it impossible to lie down comfortably. Boils would form on the eyelids, inside the mouth, and even on the tongue. Some sufferers couldn't eat because their mouths were so full of sores. Others couldn't walk because the soles of their feet were covered in painful boils. The smell was apparently overwhelming. The combination of infected tissue, pus, and the various treatments applied created a stench that made sufferers social pariahs. Chronicles describe how even family members struggled to stay in the same room with Job's disease patients. Some sufferers were housed in special hospitals, or sent to live in huts outside town boundaries, not because the disease was thought contagious, but because the sight and smell were unbearable. The theological implications of Job's disease created a unique social response. On one hand, sufferers were seen as being tested by God like the biblical Job, potentially holy figures whose faith was being refined through suffering. On the other hand, such extreme affliction was often interpreted as divine punishment for hidden sins. This created a paradox where sufferers were simultaneously viewed as potentially saintly and potentially damned. Some sufferers embraced the religious interpretation, seeing their disease as an opportunity for spiritual growth. They would make pilgrimages to holy sites, pray for hours despite their pain, and publicly display their suffering as a form of religious witness. There are accounts of Job's disease sufferers who were later venerated as local saints, their endurance of the disease seen as proof of exceptional holiness. Treatment approaches reflected this medical-spiritual duality. Physical treatments included lancing the boils to drain them, applying poultices made from herbs and animal fat, and bathing in special springs thought to have healing properties. Sulfur preparations were commonly used, despite often making the condition worse. Some physicians prescribed internal medicines made from mercury, antimony, and other toxic substances, believing that purging the body of corrupt humours would cure the disease. But spiritual treatments were equally important. Sufferers were encouraged to confess all sins, perform penances, and make vows to saints. Special masses were said for their recovery. Some underwent exorcisms, as the disease was sometimes attributed to demonic influence. Touching relics, particularly those associated with Job or saints who had suffered from skin diseases, was a popular treatment. The social isolation of Job's disease sufferers led to the development of special communities. Some formed informal support groups, living together in designated areas where they could help each other and share resources. These communities developed their own customs and even their own saints, holy figures who had suffered from and sometimes been cured of Job's disease. The economic impact on sufferers was devastating. Unable to work, often abandoned by family and requiring expensive treatments, many Job's disease sufferers became beggars. Medieval towns sometimes issued special licenses allowing Job's disease sufferers to beg in certain areas, recognising that they had no other means of support. Some sufferers displayed their boils to evoke pity and increase donations, turning their disease into a horrific form of street theatre. Medieval art depicts Job's disease with disturbing frequency and detail. Illuminated manuscripts show Job covered in red or black spots, surrounded by friends who cover their noses and avert their eyes. Church frescoes depicted the disease as a reminder of human frailty and divine power. These artistic representations served both as medical documentation and moral instruction. One of the most intriguing medieval medical concepts was elf shot, or water elf disease, the belief that sudden unexplained illnesses were caused by invisible arrows shot by elves, fairies, or other supernatural beings. This wasn't considered folklore but legitimate medical diagnosis, recorded in medical texts, treated by physicians and taken seriously by all levels of society. The concept reveals how medieval medicine integrated supernatural beliefs with empirical observation in ways that seem bizarre to modern minds, but were perfectly logical within their worldview. The symptoms attributed to elf shot were varied but usually involved sudden onset of illness without obvious cause. A person might be healthy one moment and deathly ill the next, with no visible injury or known exposure to disease. Sharp, stabbing pains that moved around the body were classic signs of elf shot. Paralysis, particularly of one side of the body, what we might recognise as stroke, was often blamed on elf arrows. Livestock that suddenly sickened and died were also considered victims of elf shot. Medieval medical texts describe different types of supernatural projectiles. Elf shot proper came from elves living in forests and hills. Water elf disease was caused by creatures living in rivers, lakes, and marshes. Some texts mention dwarf shot from underground beings and even demon shot from explicitly evil entities. Each type supposedly caused slightly different symptoms and required different treatments. The evidence for elf shot seemed compelling to medieval people. Prehistoric flint arrowheads, found in fields and forests, were believed to be actual elf arrows. These elf bolts were collected and studied by physicians who catalogued different types and their associated symptoms. Some medical texts include detailed drawings of various elf arrows and instructions for identifying which type had struck a patient based on their symptoms. Treatment for elf shot combined practical medicine with magical ritual in ways that blur our modern categories. Physicians would first try to locate and extract the invisible arrow. This involved careful palpation of the painful area, sometimes using special instruments blessed by priests. Some practitioners claimed to be able to see elf arrows through special stones or crystals, an early form of supernatural diagnostic imaging. Herbal remedies for elf shot were complex and specific. Common ingredients included feverfew, vervain, and other plants believed to have protective properties against supernatural forces. These were often combined with explicitly Christian elements: holy water, consecrated salt, prayers to specific saints. The herbs had to be gathered at particular times, often during specific phases of the moon or on certain holy days. One fascinating treatment involved creating a cure stone by boiling prehistoric arrowheads, the supposed elf shot, in holy water with sacred herbs. The resulting water was given to the patient to drink, while the stone was placed on the affected area. The logic was that the elf shot that caused the disease could also cure it, a principle similar to homeopathy, but with supernatural reasoning. Protective measures against elf shot were widespread. People wore amulets made from elf bolts, believing that carrying an elf arrow would protect against being shot by one. Iron objects, particularly horseshoes and knives, were hung over doorways and beds to repel elves. Certain plants, especially rowan and holly, were planted near homes for protection. These weren't seen as superstitions, but as practical public health measures. The geographic distribution of elf shot diagnoses is revealing. They were most common in rural areas, particularly those near ancient monuments, forests, or bodies of water, all places associated with supernatural beings. Urban areas had fewer elf shot cases, though they had their own supernatural disease explanations. This suggests that the diagnosis was culturally shaped by local beliefs about landscape and supernatural inhabitants. Social responses to elf shot varied by class and education. Peasants might consult local wise women or cunning men who specialised in supernatural ailments. These folk healers combined herbal knowledge with protective charms and rituals. The wealthy might employ university-trained physicians who would diagnose elf-shot using complex astrological calculations and treat it with expensive imported herbs and elaborate religious ceremonies. The church had an ambivalent relationship with elf-shot beliefs. On one hand, belief in elves and fairies was technically pagan and theologically problematic. On the other hand, the church offered its own supernatural explanations and treatments: demonic attack, divine testing, saintly intervention. Many clergy performed ceremonies to protect against or cure elf-shot, essentially Christianizing pagan medical beliefs. Legal documents from the period show that elf-shot was accepted as a legitimate cause of death or injury. Court records include cases where deaths were attributed to elf-shot rather than human action. Property disputes might hinge on whether livestock died from disease or elf-shot. Some wills included provisions for protection against elf-shot for the testator's family. While we explored the English sweating sickness earlier, there's a peculiar sequel to this medical mystery that deserves attention: the periodic returns of diseases that seem to vanish and reappear like ghostly echoes throughout medieval and early modern Europe. These weren't just recurring epidemics, but diseases that would disappear completely for generations, then suddenly return in exactly the same form, as if they had been sleeping somewhere, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The pattern of these returning diseases baffled medieval physicians. The sweating sickness would vanish for decades, then return with identical symptoms, striking the same demographic, following the same progression. Between outbreaks, not a single case would be recorded. It was as if the disease existed in some parallel realm, occasionally breaking through into our world before retreating again. Medieval medical authorities developed elaborate theories to explain these disappearing diseases. Some believed they literally travelled to other lands. The sweat was in England one year, then travelled to Germany, then perhaps to lands beyond the known world, eventually circling back. Others thought the diseases descended from and ascended to the celestial spheres, their appearance coinciding with specific planetary alignments. The concept of sleeping seeds of disease was particularly sophisticated. Some physicians theorized that diseases could lie dormant in the earth, in water, or even in the air itself, waiting for the right conditions to reawaken. This wasn't entirely wrong. We now know that some pathogens can indeed survive in environmental reservoirs, but the medieval explanation involved the seeds being literally asleep, requiring specific astronomical or divine signals to wake up. One peculiar variant that appeared several times was called the Picardy sweat, which struck northern France repeatedly between 1718 and 1861. The symptoms were remarkably similar to the English sweating sickness: sudden onset, profuse sweating, high mortality if the patient fell asleep. But it struck nearly 200 years after the English sweat had vanished. Was it the same disease, a descendant, or something entirely different that just happened to cause similar symptoms? During times of plague and disaster, medieval Europe witnessed the rise of a peculiar medical religious phenomenon: mass flagellation movements, where thousands of people would whip themselves bloody in public displays of penance. While self-mortification was an accepted religious practice, these movements went far beyond normal penance into what medieval physicians recognized as a form of collective madness that spread like a disease. The flagellant movements typically began during times of crisis: plague, famine, war. Groups of people, sometimes numbering in the thousands, would travel from town to town, whipping themselves with leather straps embedded with metal spikes. They would perform elaborate rituals, singing specific hymns, following prescribed patterns of movement, and inflicting precise numbers of lashes corresponding to religious symbolism. What made this medically interesting to medieval observers was how the practice spread. Like the dancing plague, flagellant mania seemed contagious. People who witnessed flagellant processions would spontaneously join them, abandoning their families and responsibilities. Contemporary accounts describe respectable merchants, housewives, even clergy suddenly stripping to the waist and beginning to whip themselves after watching flagellant performances. Medieval physicians noted disturbing physical effects beyond the obvious wounds. Flagellants often entered trance-like states where they seemed immune to pain. They would continue whipping themselves even as their backs were reduced to raw flesh. Some experienced religious ecstasy, claiming to see visions of Christ, Mary, or saints. Others fell into convulsions or speaking in tongues, The wounds themselves created unique medical challenges. The repeated whipping, often with dirty implements, led to severe infections. Gangrene was common. Some flagellants developed what medieval physicians called sacred flesh, scar tissue that they believed had holy properties. They would display these scars as signs of divine favour, sometimes cutting them open again to keep them fresh. Medical authorities were divided on how to respond. Some saw flagellation as a legitimate if extreme form of religious medicine. The pain and blood loss could theoretically rebalance the humours and purge corrupt materials from the body. Others recognised it as a dangerous practice that weakened people and spread disease through blood contamination and the gathering of large crowds. The psychological aspects fascinated medieval scholars. Why did rational people suddenly join these movements? Some physicians proposed that the sight of blood triggered a sympathetic response in observers' humours, creating an irresistible urge to shed their own blood. Others believed that the collective singing and rhythmic whipping created a form of enchantment that overwhelmed individual will. The Church's response was complex and evolved over time. Initially, some clergy endorsed flagellant movements as expressions of genuine piety, but as the movements grew more extreme and began challenging church authority, they were increasingly condemned. Pope Clement VI banned flagellant processions in 1349, declaring them heretical, but the practice continued underground. Long before modern archaeologists encountered the supposed curse of Tutankhamun's tomb, medieval Europeans had their own version of tomb-related diseases. Tomb fever, or cemetery sickness, was a recognised medical condition that struck those who disturbed ancient graves, entered long-sealed crypts, or even lived too close to burial grounds. Medieval physicians documented consistent symptoms and developed elaborate theories about why the dead could make the living sick. The symptoms of tomb fever were remarkably consistent across different accounts. It began with a feeling of oppressive dread, as if an invisible weight was pressing on the chest. Then came fever, but a strange fever that alternated between burning heat and freezing cold. Victims reported seeing shadows moving in peripheral vision, hearing voices calling their names, and feeling invisible touches. Many developed a fear of enclosed spaces and couldn't bear to be indoors. Medieval medical texts attributed tomb fever to corrupt airs trapped in sealed spaces. When tombs were opened, these poisonous vapours, concentrated over centuries, would rush out and infect anyone nearby. The longer a tomb had been sealed, the more dangerous its air. This wasn't entirely wrong. We now know that sealed tombs can contain dangerous fungi and bacteria, but the medieval explanation involved the air being corrupted by the spirits of the dead. The concept of posthumous contagion was sophisticated for its time. Medieval physicians believed that the diseases that killed people could linger in their burial places, growing stronger over time. Opening a plague victim's tomb years later could release concentrated plague essence. This led to elaborate protocols for safely opening tombs, including burning aromatic herbs, wearing protective amulets, and having priests bless the area first. Some tomb fevers were attributed to curses placed by the deceased. Medieval people often included curse tablets in burials, threatening illness or death to anyone who disturbed their rest. When tomb robbers or construction workers subsequently fell ill, it confirmed the power of these curses. Medical texts soberly discuss how to distinguish between natural tomb fever and curse-induced illness. Treatment for tomb fever combined medical and spiritual approaches. Physicians prescribed strong purgatives to expel the corrupt airs from the body. Patients were fumigated with burning sulphur and herbs. Some were made to drink water in which ancient coins had been boiled, the logic being that old metal could absorb old poisons. Priests performed exorcisms and masses for the dead whose tombs had been disturbed. Medieval medicine recognised what we might call depression, but their understanding of melancholia went far beyond simple sadness. It was considered a potentially fatal disease that could transform people into living shadows of themselves, and in its most extreme forms could lead to bizarre delusions, physical transformation, and death. The medieval concept of melancholia reveals a sophisticated understanding of mental health, even if the explanation seems strange to modern minds. Melancholia was caused, according to medieval medicine, by an excess of black bile, one of the 4 bodily humours. But this wasn't just a chemical imbalance. Black bile was thought to be literally black, thick like tar and cold as death itself. When it accumulated in the body, it would darken the blood, could cloud the mind and eventually transform the sufferer into something barely human. The symptoms went far beyond sadness. Melancholics developed dark skin, sunken eyes, and a corpse-like appearance. They avoided sunlight, preferring darkness. Many stopped eating, not from lack of appetite, but from the belief that they were already dead, or that their stomachs had disappeared. Some became convinced they were made of butter, and would melt if they went near fire. Others believed they had animals living inside them. One particularly disturbing variant was lycanthropic melancholia, where sufferers believed they had transformed into wolves. Unlike the clinical lycanthropy discussed earlier, these patients maintained human form but were convinced their souls had become wolf-like. They would howl at night, eat raw meat, and dig up graves, but walk upright and speak normally during the day, creating a horrifying dual existence. Medieval physicians documented cases of melancholics developing superhuman abilities. Some could go weeks without sleep or food. Others showed extraordinary strength when agitated. There are accounts of melancholics predicting deaths, seeing spirits, or knowing things they couldn't possibly know. These abilities were attributed to the black bile opening channels to the supernatural world. The social response to melancholia was complex. Unlike other forms of madness, melancholy was associated with intelligence and creativity. Scholars, artists, and clergy were considered particularly susceptible. This created a strange romanticism around the condition. Melancholy was seen as the price of genius, the burden of those who thought too deeply about the world. Treatment strategies ranged from gentle to extreme. Mild melancholy was treated with music, particularly specific mode thought to lighten the spirits. Patients were encouraged to wear bright colours, spend time in gardens, and avoid solitude. Diet was crucial. No dark foods like black bread or red wine. Instead, white foods like chicken, fish, and milk to counterbalance the black bile. For severe cases, more aggressive treatments were employed. Hellebore, a poisonous plant, was used to violently purge black bile from the system. Patients were sometimes suspended upside down to drain black bile from the brain. Some physicians attempted to literally frighten the melancholy out of patients through elaborate ruses, fake fires, staged attacks, or sudden shocks. The concept of melancholic contagion was particularly interesting. Medieval physicians believed that spending too much time with melancholics could induce melancholy in healthy people. This led to melancholics being isolated, creating a vicious cycle where the isolation worsened their condition. Some hospitals had special melancholy wards with specific architectural features: high windows to prevent jumping, smooth walls to prevent self-harm, and specific colour schemes thought to combat black bile. While not traditionally considered a disease, the medieval understanding and treatment of dental problems reveals a fascinating medical worldview where teeth were seen as windows to the soul, predictors of fate, and battlegrounds between good and evil. Toothworms were the accepted explanation for cavities, actual worms that lived in teeth and caused pain by gnawing on the roots. This wasn't metaphorical. Medieval people genuinely believed tiny worms inhabited their mouths. Medieval dental texts, complete with detailed illustrations, show these toothworms as serpent-like creatures with fierce faces and multiple legs. Different types of worms caused different dental problems. Red worms caused bleeding gums, white worms caused cavities, and black worms caused tooth death. Some texts claimed you could see the worms if you held a candle close to an affected tooth and looked carefully in a mirror. Treatments for toothworms were varied and often horrifying. One common remedy involved heating henbane seeds over hot coals and directing the smoke into the mouth. The seeds would pop and release small white filaments that looked like worms, proving that the treatment was drawing out the toothworms. Patients would see these worms and feel validated that their pain had a real, visible cause. More extreme treatments tried to poison or burn out the worms. Hot iron needles were inserted into cavities to kill worms directly. Toxic substances like mercury and arsenic were applied to teeth. Some practitioners claimed they could lure toothworms out with honey or cheese, then quickly extract them with special tools. Beyond worms, medieval dentistry recognized tooth fever, a systemic illness caused by infected teeth. They correctly observed that dental infections could spread and cause serious illness or death, though their explanation involved corrupt humours spreading from the teeth to vital organs. This led to aggressive extraction practices, with some physicians recommending removing all teeth at the first sign of decay to prevent tooth fever. The social significance of teeth in medieval society was enormous. Teeth were used in divination. Their number, arrangement, and condition could predict everything from lifespan to number of children. Losing teeth in specific orders had meaning. First molars meant financial loss, canines meant loss of strength, incisors meant loss of reputation. Teething madness was a recognised condition in both children and adults. When wisdom teeth emerged, usually in late adolescence or early adulthood, any behavioural changes were attributed to teething. Crime, religious conversion, sudden marriage, or joining a monastery might all be explained by wisdom teeth emergence. Some young adults were confined during wisdom tooth eruption to prevent teething-induced bad decisions. While hiccups might seem like a minor annoyance today, medieval Europe experienced several outbreaks of epidemic hiccups that killed hundreds of people. These weren't ordinary hiccups, but violent, continuous spasms that lasted for days or weeks, preventing eating, sleeping, or normal breathing. Medieval physicians considered epidemic hiccups a distinct disease, as dangerous as many fevers and requiring immediate intervention. The first recorded epidemic hiccup outbreak occurred in Germany in 1411, striking an entire monastery. The monks hiccuped continuously for weeks. Several died from exhaustion, others from starvation when they couldn't keep food down. The hiccup spread to nearby villages, suggesting contagion, though only certain people seemed susceptible. Young men were most affected, leading to theories about hot blood and excessive vital spirits. Medieval medical texts describe the progression of epidemic hiccups in disturbing detail. They began like normal hiccups but quickly intensified. The spasms became so violent that ribs could break. Victims couldn't speak except in short gasps between hiccups. Sleep was impossible. The hiccups continued even when patients lost consciousness. After several days, victims would begin vomiting blood from the constant spasming. Theories about causation varied wildly. Some physicians blamed corrupted air, particularly the air in enclosed spaces like monasteries and workshops. Others pointed to dietary factors. Too much cold food, fermented beverages, or spicy preparations. Astrological explanations were common, with certain planetary alignments thought to cause the diaphragm to rebel against the body. The contagious nature of epidemic hiccups puzzled medieval medicine. Unlike plague or sweating sickness, hiccups didn't seem to spread through normal contact. Instead, hearing someone hiccup could trigger hiccups in susceptible individuals. This led to quarantine measures where hiccup victims were isolated not to prevent disease spread, but to prevent the sound of their hiccuping from triggering others. Treatments range from practical to bizarre. Standard remedies like holding breath, drinking water, or sudden frights were tried first. When these failed, more extreme measures were employed. Some patients were hung upside down for hours. Others were nearly drowned. The logic being that the fear of death would shock the diaphragm back to normal. Opium and other sedatives were used, though these sometimes suppressed breathing along with the hiccups. One peculiar treatment involved hiccup transfer, the belief that hiccups could be passed from one person to another through specific rituals. Professional hiccup takers would accept payment to take on someone's hiccups, using elaborate ceremonies involving shared drinking vessels, synchronized breathing, and verbal formulas. Whether through placebo effect or coincidence, this sometimes seemed to work. As we reach the end of our journey through the bizarre diseases of medieval Europe, it's tempting to laugh at the seemingly absurd explanations and treatments our ancestors developed. Toothworms, wandering wombs, wolf transformations, and invisible elf arrows seem like products of primitive minds fumbling in the darkness of ignorance. But that would be missing the profound lessons these medieval maladies teach us about human nature, the development of medicine, and our ongoing struggle to understand our own bodies and minds. What strikes me most about medieval medicine isn't how wrong it was, but how hard people tried to be right. Every bizarre theory represented genuine attempts to explain observed phenomena. When medieval physicians said the womb wandered, they were trying to explain real symptoms, anxiety, fainting, digestive issues, that seemed to move through the body. When they diagnosed elf-shot, they were grappling with strokes, heart attacks, and other sudden onset conditions that seemed to strike from nowhere. These medieval doctors didn't have microscopes to see bacteria, X-rays to examine bones, or blood tests to check hormone levels. They had only their senses, their reasoning, and the accumulated wisdom of their predecessors. Working within these limitations, they created elaborate, internally consistent medical systems that made sense within their worldview. The four humours theory, for all its flaws, represented a sophisticated attempt to understand how diet, environment, emotion, and physical health interconnected. Many medieval medical insights were remarkably prescient. They recognised that mental and physical health were connected, even if they explained it through humours rather than neurotransmitters. They understood that diseases could spread from person to person, even without knowing about germs. They noticed that certain diseases appeared in patterns, seasonally, geographically, demographically, and tried to explain these patterns. They even recognised what we now call psychosomatic illness, understanding that the mind could create real physical symptoms. The social responses to medieval diseases reveal timeless human behaviours. The dancing plagues and flagellant movements show how psychological distress can manifest as physical symptoms, especially during times of social upheaval. The royal touch for scrofula demonstrates the powerful placebo effect, and how belief in treatment can sometimes be as important as the treatment itself. The fear and isolation experienced by those with visible diseases like Job's disease or leprosy reminds us how illness has always carried social stigma. What's particularly fascinating is how cultural context shaped both the expression and understanding of disease. The glass delusion only made sense in a society where glass was rare and magical. Lycanthropy reflected genuine fears of wolves and wilderness. The wandering womb theory emerged from a society with rigid gender roles and limited understanding of female anatomy. These weren't universal human experiences, but culturally specific ways of experiencing and explaining illness. Medieval medicine also shows us how knowledge can be lost and rediscovered. The ancient Greeks and Romans had relatively advanced medical knowledge that was largely forgotten in Western Europe during the early Middle Ages, preserved in the Islamic world, and then reintroduced to Europe through translation and cultural exchange. This reminds us that scientific progress isn't always linear. Knowledge can be lost, suppressed, or ignored for centuries before being rediscovered. The role of religion in medieval medicine offers interesting perspectives on the relationship between faith and healing. While modern medicine strives for secular objectivity, medieval medicine seamlessly integrated spiritual and physical treatment. Prayer, pilgrimage, and penance were considered legitimate medical interventions. This holistic approach, while based on incorrect assumptions about divine intervention, recognized what modern medicine is rediscovering, that patient beliefs, social support, and psychological state significantly impact physical health. The medieval period also demonstrates how economic and social factors influence disease and treatment. The wealthy could afford better food, cleaner living conditions, and more elaborate medical care, but they also suffered from diseases of excess like gout and certain types of madness associated with rich diet and idle lifestyle. The poor faced malnutrition and unsanitary conditions, but sometimes avoided diseases that targeted the wealthy, showing how social position created different disease vulnerabilities. Looking at medieval medical mistakes also helps us recognize our own potential blind spots. In 500 years, what will future historians think of our medical practices? Will they laugh at our chemotherapy the way we laugh at bloodletting? Will they be amazed that we ignored obvious connections between health and factors we haven't yet recognized? Medieval medicine reminds us to maintain humility about our current understanding. The placebo effect, so clearly demonstrated in treatments like the royal touch, remains powerful in modern medicine. Studies show that expensive placebos work better than cheap ones, that injected placebos work better than oral ones, and that placebos given with confident authority work better than those given uncertainly. Medieval medicine, with its elaborate rituals, expensive ingredients, and authoritative practitioners, inadvertently maximized placebo responses. The medieval understanding of contagion, while wrong in specifics, led to practices that sometimes worked. Quarantine, isolation of the sick, and burning of contaminated materials could effectively limit disease spread, even if the reasoning involved corrupt airs rather than microorganisms. This shows how correct practices can emerge from incorrect theories, and why we should examine traditional medicine for effective treatments, even when the explanations seem absurd. Medieval medicine also demonstrated remarkable creativity in the face of ignorance. Unable to see inside living bodies, physicians developed elaborate external diagnostic techniques. Unable to understand disease mechanisms, they created complex classification systems based on observable symptoms. Unable to cure most ailments, they developed sophisticated palliative care techniques. This creativity in the face of limitation is deeply human and admirable. The psychological dimensions of medieval diseases remain relevant today. Mass psychogenic illness still occurs, from the dancing plague of 1518 to the laughing epidemics in African schools in the 1960s, to recent cases of mysterious symptoms spreading through social groups. The forms change, but the underlying phenomenon of psychological distress manifesting as physical symptoms in social contexts remains consistent. The gender dimensions of medieval medicine, particularly evident in conditions like the wandering womb, remind us how medical knowledge can be shaped by social prejudices. Women's health concerns were often dismissed or misunderstood, their symptoms attributed to inherent female weakness rather than legitimate medical conditions. While we've made progress, gender bias in medical research and treatment remains a significant issue today. The integration of environmental factors in medieval medical thinking, while often incorrectly applied, recognized important connections we're only now fully appreciating. They understood that living near swamps could cause disease, though they blamed bad air rather than mosquitoes, that certain locations seemed inherently unhealthy, and that seasonal patterns affected health. Modern environmental medicine is in many ways returning to these observations with better explanations. Medieval medicine's emphasis on individual constitution, the idea that different people had different humoral balances and therefore needed different treatments, prefigures modern personalized medicine. While we now talk about genetic profiles rather than sanguine or melancholic temperaments, the core insight that medical treatment should be tailored to individual characteristics remains valid. The role of emotion in medieval medicine, where anger could literally heat the blood and sadness could generate toxic black bile, seems quaint until we consider modern understanding of how chronic stress affects immune function, how depression impacts physical health, and how emotional states influence everything from heart disease to cancer outcomes. Medieval physicians were wrong about mechanisms but right about connections. Perhaps most importantly, studying medieval diseases reminds us of human resilience. These people faced terrifying, inexplicable illnesses with limited tools and understanding, yet they persevered. They developed communities of care, created meaning from suffering, and maintained hope despite overwhelming challenges. Their courage in facing mysterious diseases without modern medical knowledge is genuinely inspiring. The medieval approach to death and dying, where diseases like the sweating sickness could kill within hours, fostered a different relationship with mortality than we have today. Death was omnipresent, unpredictable, and often swift. This shaped not just medical practice, but entire worldviews, art, literature, and social structures. The medieval memento mori, remember you must die, emerged from this constant proximity to death. As we face modern medical challenges, antibiotic resistance, emerging diseases, mental health crises, and the ongoing effects of global health disparities, medieval medicine offers both cautionary tales and inspiration. It warns us against dogmatic thinking, reminds us that current knowledge is provisional, and shows how creative humans can be when facing health challenges with limited resources. The story of medieval diseases is ultimately a human story, of fear and courage, ignorance and insight, suffering and resilience. These weren't primitive people stumbling in darkness, but our ancestors doing their best with limited tools to understand and alleviate human suffering. Their successes and failures, their insights and delusions, all contribute to the long, ongoing human project of understanding and treating disease. So the next time you visit a doctor, receive a diagnosis based on blood tests and imaging, or take an antibiotic for an infection, remember the medieval physicians who diagnosed by examining urine, who prescribed prayers and pilgrimages, who believed in toothworms and wandering wombs. They were part of the same human endeavour, the quest to understand why we get sick and how we might get better. Their bizarre theories and strange treatments weren't fundamentally different from our current efforts. They were earlier chapters in the same story, steps on the same journey toward understanding the miraculous, fragile, endlessly complex entities we call our bodies. And just as we look back on medieval medicine with a mixture of amusement and respect, future generations will undoubtedly view our current medical knowledge with similar feelings. Thank you for joining me on this strange journey through medieval medicine. May your humours remain balanced, your womb stay firmly in place, and may you never encounter an elf with a bow and arrow. And remember, if someone offers to cure your illness with a royal touch, maybe get a second opinion first. Until next time, stay healthy, stay curious, and be grateful for modern medicine, flawed as it may be. It's certainly better than having your head drilled to let out demons or being prescribed a diet of unicorn horn and crushed pearls. Though honestly, after learning about medieval medicine, waiting 3 hours in a modern emergency room doesn't seem quite so bad anymore, does it? Sweet dreams, and remember, if you start dancing uncontrollably or believe you've turned to glass, please consult a licensed medical professional, not a medieval physician's manual. Trust me on this one. To truly understand medieval diseases, we need to dive deeper into the fundamental theory that underpinned all medieval medicine, the doctrine of the four humours. This wasn't just a medical theory, but a complete worldview that explained everything from personality to disease, from diet to destiny. Every bizarre treatment, every strange diagnosis, every peculiar prescription made perfect sense within this elaborate system that dominated European medical thinking for over 1,000 years. The four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, weren't just bodily fluids in the medieval understanding. They were the fundamental substances that determined everything about a person's physical health, mental state, personality and even moral character. Each humour had specific qualities. Blood was hot and wet, phlegm was cold and wet, yellow bile was hot and dry, and black bile was cold and dry. The balance of these humours, unique to each individual, created their complexion or temperament. A sanguine person dominated by blood was cheerful, sociable, and prone to excessive pleasure-seeking. They were susceptible to fevers, apoplexy, and diseases of excess. Their ideal diet consisted of cooling, drying foods to counterbalance their natural heat and moisture. They needed regular bloodletting to prevent their abundant blood from corrupting and causing disease. Spring was their dangerous season when rising heat and moisture could throw their already blood-rich constitution into fatal imbalance. The phlegmatic temperament, dominated by phlegm, produced slow, steady, reliable people, who were also prone to laziness and dullness. They suffered from respiratory ailments, dropsy, and paralysis. Their thick, cold phlegm needed to be heated and thinned through spicy foods, vigorous exercise, and exposure to dry heat. Winter was their nemesis, when environmental cold and moisture augmented their already phlegm-heavy constitution. Choleric individuals, ruled by yellow bile, were ambitious, quick-tempered, and natural leaders, but also prone to rage and violence. They suffered from burning fevers, jaundice, and inflammatory diseases. Their treatment required cooling, moistening remedies, cucumber, lettuce, and cold baths. Summer heat could drive them to madness as environmental heat combined with their internal fire to literally cook their brains. The melancholic temperament dominated by black bile produced scholars, artists, and deep thinkers, but also depression, delusion, and madness. They were susceptible to consumption, cancer, and all diseases of wasting. Their treatment focused on warming, moistening therapies, wine, music, and companionship. Autumn, with its cold, dry qualities, could tip them into suicidal despair. But the humours weren't static. They changed throughout the day, with blood dominating in morning, yellow bile at noon, black bile in afternoon, and phlegm at night. They shifted with the seasons, with age, blood in youth, yellow bile in young adulthood, black bile in middle age, phlegm in old age, and with lifestyle. Every food consumed, every emotion felt, every activity undertaken could alter the humoral balance. This created an incredibly complex diagnostic system. A fever in a sanguine person required different treatment than the same fever in a melancholic. Time of onset mattered. A morning fever suggested blood corruption. An evening fever indicated phlegm. The colour of the fever, red, white, yellow, or black, revealed which humour was corrupted. Even the pattern of fever, continuous, intermittent, or recurring, had humoral significance. Medieval physicians became masters at reading humoral signs. They examined urine not just for colour, but for consistency, sediment patterns, and even taste. Yes, tasting urine was a standard diagnostic procedure, with different flavours indicating different humoral imbalances. Sweet urine suggested blood corruption, bitter indicated yellow bile, salty meant phlegm, and sour pointed to black bile. Pulse diagnosis was equally elaborate. There weren't just fast and slow pulses, but musical pulses, rhythmic variations indicating specific humoral patterns. Ant pulses, weak and creeping, suggesting phlegm dominance, and gazelle pulses, leaping and bounding, indicating yellow bile excess. Physicians claimed to feel the individual humours flowing through the arteries, each with its distinctive texture and temperature. The therapeutic implications were staggering. Every medical intervention had to consider the patient's natural temperament, current humoral state, time of day, season, astrological influences, and recent lifestyle. A purge that might save a phlegmatic patient could kill a choleric one. Bloodletting that benefited a sanguine person in spring could be fatal for a melancholic in autumn. Diet was medicine's first line of defence. Foods were classified by their humoral qualities and prescribed or forbidden based on the patient's needs. Hot, dry foods like pepper and garlic could save a phlegmatic but kill a choleric. Cold, moist foods like cucumber and melon could balance a choleric but worsen a phlegmatic. The timing of meals, the combination of foods, even the cooking method affected their humoral properties. Medieval medicine wasn't just about earthly humours. It was intimately connected to the heavens. Medical astrology was a required subject in medieval medical schools, and no respectable physician would diagnose or treat without consulting celestial influences. This wasn't superstition, but sophisticated proto-science that attempted to understand how cosmic forces affected human health. Every planet, zodiac sign, and celestial event had specific medical significance that could determine the difference between cure and catastrophe. The human body was mapped onto the zodiac in a system called the zodiac man, or Homo signorum. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms and lungs, Cancer the chest and stomach, Leo the heart, Virgo the intestines, Libra the kidneys, Scorpio the genitals, Sagittarius the thighs, Capricorn the knees, Aquarius the shins, and Pisces the feet. This wasn't metaphorical. Medieval physicians believed each zodiac sign literally controlled its assigned body part. Treatment timing was crucial. You never performed surgery on a body part when its ruling sign was ascendant. Operating on the head when Aries was prominent was considered potentially fatal. Bloodletting from the arms during Gemini's reign could cause unstoppable hemorrhaging. This created complex scheduling where emergency treatments might be delayed for days waiting for favourable astrological conditions. The planets added another layer of complexity. Saturn, cold and dry, caused chronic diseases, melancholy, and conditions of old age. Jupiter, warm and moist, governed blood, liver, and growth, with its diseases being generally curable. Mars, hot and dry, brought fevers, infections, and violent injuries. The Sun controlled the heart and vital spirits, with its diseases affecting life force itself. Venus governed reproduction and pleasure, with its ailments affecting fertility and desire. Mercury ruled the nervous system and communication, causing stammering, paralysis, and madness when afflicted. The Moon, governing fluids and cycles, caused epilepsy, lunacy, and all periodic diseases. The Moon's phases were particularly important. New moon surgeries were considered dangerous as the body's fluids were at their lowest. Full moon amplified all symptoms. Fevers burned hotter, madness intensified, wounds bled more. The waxing moon was ideal for treatments that added to the body, taking medicines, eating strengthening foods, building blood. The waning moon was perfect for purging, bloodletting, and removing diseased tissue. Planetary hours added minute-by-minute complexity. Each hour of the day and night was ruled by a different planet, starting with the day's ruling planet at sunrise. A Mercury hour was ideal for taking medicines affecting the mind. A Venus hour was perfect for fertility treatments. A Saturn hour was avoided for any treatment except those for chronic conditions. Physicians carried elaborate tables calculating planetary hours for each day of the year. Eclipses were medical emergencies waiting to happen. Solar eclipses poisoned the air, causing plagues and mass poisonings. Lunar eclipses corrupted bodily fluids, triggering epileptic fits and madness. Physicians prescribed preventive treatments before eclipses, purging to empty the body of corruptible humours, special diets to strengthen resistance, and remaining indoors during the eclipse itself. Comets were harbingers of devastating disease. The Great Comet of 1066, later known as Halley's Comet, was blamed for plagues that followed. Physicians believed comets corrupted the upper air, which then descended as poisonous rain or mist. The colour, size and trajectory of comets predicted different diseases. Red comets brought fevers, pale comets caused consumption, and twin-tailed comets triggered madness. Birth charts weren't just for fortune-telling, they were medical documents. A skilled physician could predict a patient's lifetime health challenges from their natal chart. Someone born under Saturn would be prone to melancholic diseases. Mars in the 6th house at birth indicated a life of fevers and injuries. The moon's position determined susceptibility to periodic illnesses. This astrological medicine created elaborate treatment protocols. A typical prescription might read, "Let the patient take this medicine when the moon is waxing in an earth sign, during a Jupiter hour, avoiding Saturn days, continuing until Mercury enters Gemini." Missing any of these conditions could render the treatment useless or harmful. Before germ theory, medieval medicine had the miasma theory, the belief that diseases spread through corrupted air or bad air, malaria, from which we get malaria. This wasn't simple superstition, but a complex theory about how environmental factors cause disease. Miasmas could arise from swamps, graveyards, rotting matter, or even astrological influences, and understanding them was crucial for preventing and treating disease. Miasmas were invisible, but had distinctive characteristics that trained physicians could detect. They might have specific smells: sulphurous, sweet, putrid, or metallic. They could be thick or thin, hot or cold, dry or moist. Some miasmas were heavy, pooling in low-lying areas, while others were light, rising to affect upper floors and mountains. Each type caused different diseases and required different responses. Swamp miasma was the most studied type. Rising from marshes and stagnant water, it caused intermittent fevers, what we now know as malaria, AUs, and various wasting diseases. The miasma was thought to be generated by rotting vegetation underwater, releasing poisonous vapours that corrupted the air. This led to accurate observations. People living near swamps did get sick more often, even if the mosquito connection remained unknown. Graveyard miasma was particularly feared. The decomposition of bodies, especially those who died of disease, released corrupted vapours that could cause illness in the living. This led to elaborate burial practices: deep graves, lime to accelerate decomposition, and aromatic herbs to neutralize miasmatic vapours. Churches built on old graveyards were considered particularly dangerous, with their confined air concentrating centuries of death miasma. Urban miasma developed from the concentration of human waste, rotting food and industrial byproducts. Medieval cities, with their narrow streets and poor sanitation, were seen as miasmatic breeding grounds. This led to public health measures that, while based on incorrect theory, actually improved health: street cleaning, waste removal, and regulations about where butchers and tanners could operate. Seasonal miasmas explained epidemic patterns. Summer miasmas, generated by heat acting on moisture, caused fevers and fluxes. Autumn miasmas from rotting vegetation brought melancholic diseases. Winter miasmas, though weaker due to cold, caused respiratory ailments. Spring miasmas, from the earth exhaling after winter, triggered skin diseases and madness. Protection against miasma involved complex strategies. Aromatic substances, herbs, spices, vinegar, were believed to neutralize bad air. During plague outbreaks, people carried pomanders, perforated balls containing aromatics, or held herb bundles to their noses. Physicians wore distinctive beaked masks filled with aromatics, creating a buffer of good air between them and miasmatic patients. Fire was thought to purify air by consuming miasmas. During epidemics, great bonfires were lit in public squares, sometimes burning aromatic woods and herbs. Cannon were fired to disrupt and disperse miasmatic clouds. Some cities required households to keep fires burning continuously during plague outbreaks, regardless of season. Architecture reflected miasmatic concerns. Windows were positioned to avoid miasma-bearing winds. Hospitals were built on high ground where air was considered purer. Sick rooms had specific ventilation requirements, enough air movement to prevent miasma accumulation, but not so much that it spread disease. The orientation of beds mattered, with different diseases requiring different positioning relative to airflow. Personal behaviour could generate individual miasmas. Strong emotions, particularly anger and fear, heated the blood and created personal miasmatic clouds. Sexual excess generated a specific type of miasma that caused weakness and consumption. Even thinking too hard could create cerebral miasma, explaining why scholars were prone to certain illnesses. Medieval Europe lived in constant fear of poisoning, and not without reason. In an era when food preservation was primitive, water sources were often contaminated, and political assassination was commonplace. Distinguishing between natural disease food poisoning and deliberate poisoning was nearly impossible. This created a complex medical specialty, focused on preventing, detecting and treating poisonings that revealed both medieval paranoia and surprising medical sophistication. The symptoms of poisoning, as described in medieval medical texts, were varied and often indistinguishable from natural diseases. Sudden illness after eating, progressive weakness, unusual bodily discharges and changes in skin colour could all indicate poisoning. But these same symptoms could result from spoiled food, natural disease or humoral imbalance. This diagnostic uncertainty created a culture where any sudden illness might be attributed to poisoning. Poison detection methods range from practical to magical. Wealthy households employed food tasters, though this only protected against fast-acting poisons. Unicorn horn, usually narwhal tusk, was believed to neutralize poison or change colour in its presence. Bezoar stones, concretions from animal stomachs, were thought to absorb poisons. Toads were believed to detect poison by changing colour or dying in its presence, leading to the practice of keeping jewelled toadstones as protective amulets. The catalogue of medieval poisons was extensive and often accurate. Arsenic, called inheritance powder for its frequent use in familial murders, was well known. Mercury, lead, and various plant toxins like hemlock, wolfsbane and deadly nightshade were documented with their symptoms and progression. But medieval toxicology also included imaginary poisons, basilisk venom, dragon blood, and powdered diamond that were feared despite being mythical or harmless. Antidotes, called alexipharmics, were big business. The most famous was theriac, also called Venice treacle, a compound containing over 60 ingredients including viper's flesh, opium, and numerous herbs. It took months to prepare and years to age properly. Theriac was supposedly effective against all poisons, venomous bites, and even plague. Its recipe was a closely guarded secret, and counterfeit theriac was common. Mithridatium, another universal antidote, supposedly originated with King Mithridates VI, who took small doses of poisons to build immunity. The medieval version contained dozens of ingredients and was taken daily by those who feared poisoning. Whether it worked is debatable, but the small amounts of toxic substances it contained might have provided some tolerance to certain poisons. Prevention strategies shaped medieval dining culture. Shared dishes and communal eating weren't just social customs, but safety measures. Poisoning one person meant poisoning everyone. The ritual of the loving cup, where host and guest drank from the same vessel, demonstrated trust. Salt cellars were closely guarded, as salt was believed to neutralize many poisons. The fear of slow-acting poisons was particularly intense. These cold poisons supposedly killed gradually over months or years, making detection and treatment nearly impossible. Symptoms included gradual wasting, hair loss, and weakness, probably describing various chronic diseases but attributed to poisoning. This fear led to elaborate food testing protocols and chronic consumption of preventive antidotes. Political poisoning shaped medical practice. Court physicians were expected to be poison experts, able to prevent, detect, and treat poisoning attempts. Some specialized in judicial poisoning, administering poisons that mimicked natural disease for political assassination. Others focused on protecting their patrons, developing elaborate testing protocols and preventive regimens. The Borgia family became synonymous with poisoning in the Renaissance, though they were continuing medieval traditions. Cantarella, their supposed signature poison, was described as a white powder that caused delayed death resembling natural disease. Whether this specific poison existed or was mythology, the fear it inspired was real and shaped diplomatic and social interactions. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval medicine was the doctrine of signatures, the belief that God had marked everything in nature, with a sign indicating its medicinal use. Plants, animals, and minerals that resembled body parts or diseases were thought to treat those specific conditions. This wasn't considered superstition, but divine revelation, a way God ensured humans could find remedies for their ailments. Walnuts, with their brain-like appearance, were prescribed for head injuries and mental illness. The hard shell represented the skull, the papery partition the protective membranes, and the convoluted nut meat the brain itself. Eating walnuts supposedly strengthened memory, cured headaches, and even helped madness. Modern science has found that walnuts do contain omega-3 fatty acids beneficial for brain health, suggesting some signatures might not be entirely wrong. Bloodroot, which leaked red sap when cut, was obviously meant to treat blood disorders. Hepatica leaves, shaped like liver lobes, treated liver disease. Lungwort, with spotted leaves resembling diseased lungs, cured respiratory ailments. Kidney beans treated kidney disease. Eyebright, with its eye-like flowers, improved vision, and toothwort, with its tooth-shaped roots, helped dental problems. The signatures extended beyond simple resemblance. Plants growing in wet places treated diseases of excess moisture. Desert plants helped with dry conditions. Plants that grew quickly treated acute diseases, while slow-growing plants helped chronic conditions. Even the time of flowering mattered. Spring flowers treated young people's diseases. Autumn plants helped the elderly. Animals provided signatures too. The fierce badger's fat treated aggressive diseases. Peaceful dove's blood calmed fevers. Fox lungs from an animal known for endurance treated respiratory weakness. Even animal behaviours provided medical insights. Hibernating animals provided medicines for sleep disorders, while migrating birds offered remedies for travelling ailments. Minerals and gems had their own signatures. Red stones like carnelian treated blood disorders. Yellow stones helped jaundice. Clear crystals improved vision. The hardness, colour, transparency, and even the location where stones were found all indicated their medical uses. Diamonds, the hardest substance known, treated conditions requiring strength and permanence. Astrological signatures added another layer. Plants ruled by Mars, often with red flowers or thorns, treated Mars-related diseases like fevers and wounds. Lunar plants, often white or silver, with high water content, helped with women's conditions and mental illness. Solar plants, yellow flowers facing the sun, strengthened the heart and vital spirits. The doctrine created elaborate correspondences. A complete treatment might require multiple signatures aligning. A brain-shaped walnut gathered under Mercury's influence, prepared with herbs showing head signatures, administered when Mercury ruled the hour. Missing any element reduced effectiveness. This system gave ordinary people some medical autonomy. Anyone could learn basic signatures and treat simple ailments with garden herbs. The local wise woman or cunning man, expert in signatures, provided community healthcare. This democratic aspect of signature medicine sometimes conflicted with professional physicians who preferred complex, expensive treatments. The doctrine influenced botanical illustration and herbals. Plants were drawn to emphasize their signatures rather than botanical accuracy. Mandrake roots were depicted as human-shaped, though natural mandrakes rarely show such clear anthropomorphism. These stylized illustrations taught signatures more than plant identification.